Guys, think about this question for a moment. Could the Earth really be flat? Answer: no. Now, the wealthy can literally buy a ticket and go to space themselves. Very soon, ordinary citizens will probably start being able to do this too. Instagram will be flooded with selfies taken from orbit. As you can see, in this era, the shape of the Earth is no longer an optional belief. It is an undisputed fact. In fact, think about it this way. The Middle Ages are often described as a dark period, dominated by enemies of science and regressive ideas running rampant. But in reality, even in that period, the overwhelming majority of people did not believe the Earth was flat, because we have known that the Earth is spherical for 2,200 years. This is not new. But of course, once social media put a microphone into everyone's hands, all kinds of people started finding themselves an audience. And just because someone is listening, people began falling under the false impression that the absurd things they say must have some meaning or value. At the forefront of these are the flat earthers. Yes, as hard as it is to believe, today there is still a small but loud group who believe the Earth is flat. And in order to prove their beliefs, these individuals challenge standard astronomical models and try to show that these models cannot explain our everyday observations. There's no problem with that, of course. Science is supposed to challenge itself, to constantly test what we think we know. But as you might guess, this cult does not possess the virtue of changing their minds in the face of evidence and explanation. Their only goal is to follow the logical fallacy known as poisoning the well by flooding the internet with claims that can confuse ordinary people, especially so that they can recruit those without a solid science education into their ranks and profit off them by selling products and increasing their fame. Now, in this video, I won't try to refute every single claim of flat earthers, because over the years they have put forward so many ridiculous assertions that even if I tried to address just the most famous ones, this video would last for hours. Instead, in this video, we're going to do something much more interesting and scientifically much more valuable. We're going to assume for a moment that the flat earthers' claim is true. So, if the Earth really were flat, what do you think would change in our lives? Let's find out. What exactly flat earthers believe varies somewhat from person to person. But at its core, they all believe the Earth is not spherical like a ball, but flat like a disk. Many of them believe that what we know as the North Pole is at the center of this disk, and that all the other continents are spread around this center. And many of them think that the edges of this disk, which you could supposedly fall off, are surrounded by Antarctica, which they believe to be an ice wall, just like in Game of Thrones. The mythology they build on top of this basic framework varies greatly from person to person and region to region. But even before going any further, this arbitrary change in just the shape of the Earth changes everything. Everything. Because if you remove one of the beautifully fitting pieces of this giant puzzle we call science, and try to force a piece that does not fit with the rest of the puzzle into the system, you are forgetting that science progresses cumulatively, and that each piece builds upon the previous ones to explain the universe. And this collapses the internal consistency of science. Your observations begin to lose meaning. Your explanations become inconsistent. For example, let's say everything else stays the same, but we make the Earth a disk instead of a sphere. Could a disk-shaped planet remain stable? No. As I've explained before, in the universe, objects with sufficient mass inevitably become spherical, because gravity, by definition, is a force that tries to bring mass together. In smaller bodies like asteroids, gravity is not strong enough to overcome the rigidity, that is the stiffness, of the material, so these bodies can have irregular shapes. But as mass increases and gravity strengthens, the mass compresses until its distance from the center becomes uniform. The only shape in which all surface points are at equal distance from the center is a sphere. That's why all bodies larger than an asteroid, dwarf planets, stars, and black holes, are spherical. So why shouldn't the Earth be spherical like the Moon or Mars or the Sun? This is not a preference. It is a mathematical necessity. In short, if the Earth were a disk, it would quickly break apart, and those fragments would reorganize until they formed a sphere. We see this happening constantly in space after collisions and inside our simulations. But let's help the flat earthers and assume for a moment that the Earth could remain stable in a disk shape. In that case, what would we expect to change on the surface? First of all, the direction. Your weight as pulled would completely change. As you know, on Earth, down is the direction in which your mass is pulled toward the center of the Earth. That's why someone in the southern hemisphere is not standing upside down. As I've explained before, there's no universal uppy or down. Because we're in the northern hemisphere, we expect our up and down to be the same for everyone. But that's not the case. Wherever gravity pulls you, that is down for you. This fact would also apply on a flat Earth. But here's the problem. On a disc-shaped Earth, since there is no spherical center, gravity would always pull you toward the center of the disk. So if you opened a flat Earth map, someone living in Turkey would be pulled in this direction, while someone living in America would be pulled in that direction. And I'm not talking about slightly downward, I'm talking about being pulled sideways. Needless to say, we do not experience such a directional difference. And it wouldn't just affect people. Massive bodies of water like the oceans would also be pulled toward the center on a disk. So water could not spread evenly across the surface the way flat earthers like to claim. All the oceans would pile up in the middle of the world, forming a massive bulge. The outer regions of the disk would be much drier. Likewise, since trees grow in the opposite direction of gravity, they would grow at different angles in different regions of a disc-shaped Earth. And that's not all. Everywhere on Earth, gravitational acceleration is roughly 9.81 meters per second squared. So no matter where you weigh yourself, the scale shows roughly the same number. The only reason for this is that the Earth is a sphere. If the Earth were flat as you move toward the edges of the disk, gravity would not only become increasingly tilted, it would also gradually become stronger. So again, following the flat Earth map, if you weigh 90 kilos in Turkey, when you visit South Africa and step on the same scale, you might see that you weigh 150 kilos. Because remember, as I explained before, the scales don't actually measure your mass. They measure the product of your mass and the local gravitational acceleration. And at the outer parts of the disk, gravity would be so strong that even though you'd be standing perpendicular to the surface, you'd feel as if you were climbing a mountain, being pulled toward the center with enormous force. Accordingly, buildings closer to the edge of the disk would need to be built at increasingly steep angles just to feel like they're standing upright. There's more. We know that hurricanes in the northern hemisphere rotate counterclockwise, and in the southern hemisphere, clockwise. The reason is the Coriolis force. On a flat Earth, to create this effect, the disk would need to rotate around its own axis. And even then, depending on the direction of rotation, hurricanes everywhere would rotate in the same direction. We wouldn't see different directions in different hemispheres. To solve this, different parts of the disk would have to rotate in different directions. For example, the inner parts counterclockwise and the outer parts clockwise. So there would be a point on Earth where if you took one step, you'd rotate toward the east, and one step further, you'd rotate toward the west. Do you see how quickly the flat Earth model descends into absurdity? Do you see how when you move even a single stone in science, everything collapses on top of you? Some flat earthers try to solve this by imagining the disk as infinite or nearly infinite in size. In that case, according to Gauss's law, gravity would point downward everywhere and have a constant magnitude. But why should only the Earth be infinite in size? And if it were infinite, how did it form? Because even if we can define infinity in mathematics, we know that in the physical world, properties like length, mass, or density cannot be infinite. Moreover, we can personally experience that the Earth is not infinite and has a spherical curvature by boarding a plane or ship and traveling in a single direction, say, always east. Using a compass and a gyroscope, you can verify with certainty that you're always going in the same direction. And eventually, you return to your starting point. If the Earth were infinite and you kept going in the same direction, you would never return to where you started. Furthermore, while an infinite Earth could explain gravity pointing in the same direction and having the same magnitude, the same Gauss's law predicts that the gravitational field of an infinite body would not meaningfully decrease as you move away from it. But we know that gravity decreases as you move away from Earth. For example, at the summit of Everest, gravity is about 0.3% less than at sea level, and the International Space Station, orbiting 400 kilometers above Earth, experiences only about 90% of the gravity we experience at the surface. More importantly, in the gravitational field of an infinite Earth, objects like the Moon could not remain in orbit. So the Earth definitely cannot be infinite in size. When flat earthers are pressed on this issue, instead of changing their wrong assumptions as we should in science, they choose to complicate their mythology further to include the consequences of those wrong assumptions. For example, they try to change the nature of gravity. Some flat earthers claim that gravity is completely made up, in which case there is nothing left to explain even the simplest observations. Others try to invoke buoyancy, that is, the lifting force of fluids. They claim that objects fall not because of gravity, but because dense objects sink in air just as metal sinks in water. This is one of the clearest indicators of pseudoscience. Because the only reason we can even talk about buoyancy is that in a given gravitational field, objects of different densities behave differently. If gravity is a lie, buoyancy itself is also a lie. For example, since there is no atmosphere on the Moon, we cannot talk about buoyancy, yet objects released on the Moon still fall to the ground. Some flat earthers avoid these debates entirely by claiming that we experience gravity not because Earth is round, but because the disk is accelerating upward at 9.81 meters per second squared. If that were true, we would indeed experience gravity exactly as we do now. But until when? Even a celestial body starting from rest and accelerating constantly at 9.81 meters per second squared would reach the speed of light in just 354 days. But we know that objects with mass cannot exceed the speed of light. And if you resist this fact, then relativity theory collapses, and you can no longer explain the orbits of planets like Mercury that orbit close to their stars, or objects around black holes. Not to mention how particle accelerators, light, that is, electromagnetic radiation, and GPS systems work. But we don't even need to go that far. If the Earth were a disk and we all lived on the same side, even our simple everyday observations would become unexplainable. For example, when you look at the night sky from Turkey, you see famous constellations like Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. But our friends living in the southern hemisphere, say in Australia, cannot see them. Their most famous constellations are ones you may never have heard of, like Crux, the Southern Cross, or Carina. Because the Earth is round, and people in different parts of the world are actually looking at completely different directions of space. But if the Earth were flat, since we'd all be looking in the same direction, we would see exactly the same stars. Furthermore, if you photograph the relative motion of stars using long exposure from different parts of the Earth, you'll see that in the northern hemisphere they rotate counterclockwise. At the equator they move in a relatively straight line, and in the southern hemisphere, clockwise. There is no coherent geometry that can explain these observations on a flat Earth. And of course, the geology and climate of a disc-shaped Earth would be completely different. During Earth's formation, heavy elements sank to the planet's center due to their own gravity, forming our iron-nickel core. Lighter elements remained near the surface. This layering enables the existence of the liquid outer core that powers Earth's dynamo, the main source of our magnetic field. If you turn the Earth into a disk, gravity would act toward the center of the disk rather than the center of a sphere, making the formation of an ordered core impossible. As a result, our magnetosphere could never exist. In that case, we could not explain why charged particles from the sun follow magnetic field lines in our atmosphere. And it doesn't stop there. If you turn the Earth into a disk, days, years, and seasons lose their meaning entirely. At the simplest level, we know that at the exact same time of day, objects of the same height cast shadows of different lengths at different locations on Earth. For example, about 2,200 years ago, Eratosthenes personally observed how much the bottoms of wells in Alexandria and Aswan, or Siene as it was known then, were illuminated at exactly noon. While the wells in Siene, closer to the equator, were fully illuminated by the overhead sun at noon, parts of the wells in Alexandria remained in shadow at the same time. If the Earth were flat, the shadows in these two places should have been exactly the same length. But there was a clear difference. And as I explained before, even back then it was known that the sun was very far away, and its rays reached Earth in nearly perfect parallel lines. So Eratosthenes realized that the only thing that could produce this shadow difference was the curvature of the Earth's surface. Another thing Eratosthenes noticed was that the difference in illumination depended on how curved the surface was. He had the distance between the two locations measured as 5,000 stadia, about 787.5 kilometers in modern units. He calculated that the shadow difference corresponded to exactly 7.2 degrees of angular difference. And since 7.2 degrees is 1/50 of 360 degrees, he multiplied 787.5 kilometers by 50 and calculated the Earth's circumference as 39,375 kilometers. Today, we know it is 40,075 kilometers. In other words, 2,200 years ago, using only his mind, his eyes, his hands, and his assistant's feet, starting from an extremely simple observation anyone could make, Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with only about a 2% margin of error. How amazing is that? Can you imagine? It is impossible to explain this observed shadow difference on a flat Earth with a distant large sun. So flat earthers again choose to add assumptions that create extra problems to their mythology. They claim that the sun is not a giant fusion reactor 150 million kilometers away with a diameter of 1.4 million kilometers, but rather a weak point light source only 5 to 6,000 kilometers away and only 50 kilometers in diameter. Such a nearby light source could indeed create shadows of different lengths at different latitudes, like holding a flashlight at different angles. But this supposed solution creates many more problems. First of all, with this model, you can no longer explain the illumination patterns we currently observe on Earth. For example, Antarctica experiences 6 months of night and 6 months of day. Even observers funded by flat earthers have seen this with their own eyes and posted it on YouTube. So they cannot deny it. Yet flat earthers also claim that Antarctica is a wall surrounding the Earth. So how can this entire wall remain illuminated or dark for 6 months at a time, while the rest of the flat Earth, say Turkey, continues to experience roughly 12-hour day-night cycles? To solve this, flat earthers talk about reflections and such. But remember, their earlier assumptions already distorted the very nature of light. So to explain even what you call reflection, you would need to invent an entirely new science, just so the Earth can be flat. Moreover, on a flat Earth, how does such a nearby sun set? How does it rise? Because imagine, on a flat Earth, as the sun moved away from you, it would gradually get smaller in the sky, smaller, but it would never truly set below the horizon. Because for that, it would have to go below the horizon. In reality, since the Earth rotates, the sun goes to the other side of the Earth, making sunset possible. By the way, speaking of perspective, as ships move away from you, they disappear over the horizon gradually. First the hull, then the mass. This is an observation that can never be explained on a flat Earth. So, flat earthers invoke perspective illusion, claiming that the ship doesn't disappear beyond the horizon but merely gets smaller, and that, with enough zoom or a powerful enough telescope, it can easily be brought back into view. First of all, perspective does not work that way. Perspective makes an object appear to shrink or grow from all angles. Moreover, perspective cannot explain a ship gradually disappearing and reappearing in parts. If it were perspective, the entire ship would gradually shrink and vanish. Part of it wouldn't dip below the horizon while other parts remained visible. And by the way, on a flat Earth, a lunar eclipse could never occur, because for a lunar eclipse, the Earth must pass between the Sun and the Moon. If both the Sun and the Moon always remain on the same side of the Earth, and remember, in their model, it's impossible for them to pass to the other side without setting for all observers at once, then there would be nothing to cast a shadow on the Moon. Of course, as they will likely flood the comments, flat earthers try to explain all these anomalies by introducing more debunked complexities, more wrong assumptions, more untestable beliefs, and outright conspiracy theories. Because think about it, suppose the Earth were flat. Who would bother hiding it and why? Why would we bother? If the Earth is flat, it's flat. Who benefits from it being round? And if someone is trying to hide this so insanely, how can hundreds of millions of teachers, academics, pilots, sailors, geographers, geologists, astronauts, physicists, soldiers, astronomers, science communicators, government agencies, and private companies all be part of this conspiracy? For millennia, even though in many cases their interests conflict with each other. Flat earthers have no answers to this except increasingly bizarre religious and occult explanations. And as with every pseudoscientific belief, it leads to other pseudoscientific beliefs, taking refuge in conspiracies like the Illuminati. Long story short, not surprisingly, flat earthers still have a lot to learn from science and the history of science. So there you have it. Simply saying the Earth is not flat, it's round, is not enough. We must also say the Earth is not flat and can never be flat, because that is what reality is. And we know this not with 99% certainty, but with 100% certainty. Today, we know that a flat Earth would look very different from what we observe now. There would be no room for confusion about this. Everyone could instantly tell that the Earth was truly flat. But no matter what I say, of course, anyone can believe anything. Belief does not require reason, logic, or evidence. Wanting to believe something and needing it for some reason is enough. This minority who believe the Earth is flat will, I am sure, continue for a while longer to challenge the fact that the Earth is spherical, just to attract attention and imagine themselves as secret discoverers of a special conspiracy. I have no doubt about that. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit like. See you, and as always, take care. And as always,